What do you think is worth protesting about? Climate change? Social inequality? The economy? What about ugly paintings? Hi, I'm Saphael. I have a master's degree in art history and nothing to do with my degree except make YouTube videos. Today, I'm talking about the 2015 movement protesting the inclusion of Renoir paintings in so many art museums, and trying to answer the question, does Renoir really suck at painting? Should you hate Renoir? And is it crazy to protest against art museums displaying, well, famous art? I'll give you a spoiler alert up front. Art is subjective, and you can like whatever you like. But I'm here to tell you what I think. In 2015, a man named Max Geller started a movement wherein he and other Renoir haters stood outside the Boston Museum of Art with signs saying, "God hates Renoir," etc. He was inspired by a trip to the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia, which houses the largest collection of Renoir paintings anywhere in the world. Everywhere, interspersed with masterpieces by other artists, there are Renoir paintings. Portraits, landscapes, still lifes. Renoir is inescapable there. Walking around the museum, he found himself wondering, why is this guy so popular? Who even likes this stuff? And in that moment, the movement was born. I'll be returning to the subject of Mr. Geller later on in the video, but first, I wanted to show a little transparency. Not too long ago, I myself was walking around the Barnes Museum with a friend, and we found ourselves asking the same questions. Why was Renoir so famous? And why does his paintings look like that? Going into the preparation for this video, I was fully expecting to only find things that vindicated my pre-existing opinions. However, this was not entirely the case. The situation is a little bit more nuanced than expected, and to explain why, I'll need to start the story at the very beginning, in 19th century France, when Renoir was born. Renoir was born in 1841 to working-class parents in the French town of Limoges. In 1845, his family moved to Paris in search of work and ended up moving into an apartment near the Louvre, which was open to the public for free on weekends. That's where Renoir first started to develop his appreciation for painting. Because of his family's financial struggles, Renoir was only able to attend school until age 12, at which point he dropped out to begin working at a porcelain factory, painting the decorations onto plates and the like. A few years later, the porcelain factory was run out of business by competitors who were able to produce porcelain at a much lower cost with the use of new machine methods. After this, Renoir started studying at the studio of the Swiss painter Charles Gleyre. It was at this point that Renoir began down a path that would change not only his own life, but would impact the world of art forever. You see, up until this point, the art world was totally controlled by the Academy. This was the institution that ran all the major art shows during this time period. Whatever the Academy liked was well respected, and the artists who gained approval from the Academy were able to make a decent living selling their paintings, for the most part. And if the Academy didn't like you, you were nobody. But what did the Academy like? It liked still lives, portraits, landscapes, and above all else, historical scenes. These were paintings done in studios with good lighting, based off of detailed underdrawings, and which the artist spent weeks, months, or even years coloring in and shading. Everything was planned out to fit the aesthetic rules the Academy laid out, and to best emulate the skills of the masters of the Renaissance and of ancient Greece, who were considered the undisputed MVPs of art. Here are two portraits by the leading art rivals of the time, Jean-Dominique Ingres and Eugène Delacroix. These were both painted in the same year. The Ingres portrait is a formal portrait. This is something a rich lady paid him to paint. Look at how much detail there is in her clothes and her fancy sparkly jewelry, and even the furniture. She's clearly sitting for this painting, meaning she's posed in a way that is just about making her look good in this painting. She's not doing anything else. It's not natural. He's smoothed out all of her features to make her look as good as possible while still looking like herself. Basically, old-fashioned Facetune. Because, face it, people don't really look like this. He is showing the most idealized version of her. Meanwhile, the Delacroix portrait is not a formal portrait. Instead, it's just a painting of a random girl meant to look beautiful and evoke emotions. She looks a bit scruffier compared to the last lady, and she's in a cemetery, which is very dramatic, and meant to make you think about things like youth and death. Her features are also very smoothed out, and there's a fair amount of detail in her clothes, but the focus is on movement and emotion, rather than simply making her look good. Even though these paintings are different, they have a lot in common. They're both really detailed, they were planned out in advance, and the subjects are realistic but highly idealized. This is what good art was when Renoir was growing up. The goal for all French artists was supposed to be as similar to these artists as possible, and make paintings that were in the same style. You weren't even supposed to want to do anything different. When Renoir was 20, he started studying to go to the academy, and met some other young painters in his classes. These included Claude Monet, Frédéric Bazille, and their friends Cézanne and Pissarro. These friends did not want to do the same thing as everybody else. They wanted to experiment. They were inspired by slightly older painters like Manet, who painted fast and loose and weren't afraid to let brushstrokes show. Renoir and his buddies were only a few years into their formal art studies when Manet showed a few paintings at the Salon, including the Luncheon on the Grass. This painting may look totally fine to you or me, but look at those trees in the background. This is not as detailed as the paintings we were looking at before. Actually, it's blurry as shit. Look at the cloth the woman on the left is sitting on. You can see the brushstrokes. You can see the paint, which hasn't been entirely blended. You can even compare the women's faces to the portraits we just saw. They are not that smooth and finely rendered. I haven't even mentioned the subject matter yet. It's weird that there are two unclothed ladies having a picnic with two clothed men, and it comes with certain implications, namely that the women might be S-workers. So basically, while this painting looks nice, fancy, and maybe even a little old-fashioned to us, to the audience at the time, it looked weird, ugly, and unfinished. Even though it was technically accepted into the Salon by the Academy, it was panned by critics who pretty much all hated it. The main people who actually liked it were Renoir and his friends. They actually liked it so much that they started meeting up with Manet at a cafe every Friday night to talk about art, and started painting and holding exhibitions together. You may have already guessed it, but these were the Impressionists, and they changed art history forever. What made Impressionism so special? Look at this piece by Claude Monet, Impression Sunrise, which gave the movement its name. You can see the paint, you can see the canvas, you can see the brushstrokes. The subject matter isn't that special either, it's ordinary, just some boats in the water at sunrise. And yet, all of that is what makes it beautiful. Unlike more traditional painters, the Impressionists often painted outside and painted what was right in front of them instead of trying to plan out a whole historical scene with models and props, or sketching a landscape and then filling all the colors in once they got back to the studio. They painted to capture the moment. They wanted to record the quality of light, the movement, and the energy of snapshots in time. They also wanted to experiment with colors, lines, composition, subject matter, and pretty much everything else. This applied to portraits, too. They might just show a woman reading in a field, not as highly posed as was traditional. Renoir's contributions include paintings such as this one, which simply portrays a bunch of young people dancing at an outdoor dance club in Paris. All of this helped to pave the way for subsequent artists like Van Gogh and Seurat, and eventually Pollock and Rothko, as the epicenter for exciting developments in Western art shifted from Paris to New York. Essentially, as we think of it now, Impressionism was the movement that first really started to interrupt the historical conventions of Western art that regulated the Western art industries, and opened the door to all of the many changes that have brought the art world to where it is today. Renoir was thoroughly enmeshed in the Impressionist movement. Manet indicated that he thought Renoir was his direct successor in the movement. This closeness can be seen partially in this painting of a group of the artists and writers hanging out in a studio. Manet is sitting at the easel, holding the paintbrushes, and he has asked Renoir to be placed directly behind him, looking over his shoulder. Meanwhile, Monet is shoved into the back corner. Renoir also organized at least one of the early Impressionist exhibitions, and was a regular part of the weekly group meetings to discuss art and philosophy. But that wasn't all. Renoir was really the only member of the group who came from a working class background. All of the other members were from middle or upper middle class backgrounds and funded their bohemian, painterly lifestyles and highly unpopular art practices with their family's money. Renoir did not have that, so he asked his friends to help him out. Sometimes they gave him money directly, but many times he also lived with them, used studio spaces they rented out for him, and most of all, they connected him with wealthy patrons and art collectors who he could network with to sell art and build his reputation. Renoir's enmeshment in the Impressionist group, the funding and the networking opportunities it gave him, played an enormous role in his success. However, his loyalty to this group did not outweigh his desire for mainstream success. As the Salon's restrictions loosened and its taste became more liberal, he preferred to show his works at the Salon rather than at the Impressionist exhibitions. He craved mainstream recognition in a way that many of his peers did not. This may be because he did not have the financial freedom to remain purely experimental and countercultural in the way some of his peers did. Once Renoir started to get recognition, his painting practice shifted towards painting portraits on commission for members of the French bourgeoisie. He continued to paint in the Impressionist style, but the subject matter, consisting primarily of portraits and nudes, was quite traditional. Although Renoir was able to attain some success completing commissions in France, the country was struggling with an economic downturn following decades of on-and-off war and civil unrest. When one of his art dealers brought his paintings to be exhibited in the United States, that's where Renoir found big success. He became wealthy and famous from his international exhibitions, which translated to money and respect back in France. And after 30-odd years receiving critical scorn, he was finally a well-off, well-respected artist, a member of the bourgeoisie, and a knight of the French Legion of Honor, the highest government-awarded recognition an artist in France could receive. Unfortunately, by this time Renoir had developed severe rheumatoid arthritis, and for the last 30 years of his life, although he continued to paint, he did so in severe discomfort between bouts of paralyzing stiffness and agony that rendered him immobile. If anything, the fact that he continued to work despite his physical condition only contributed to the growing mythos around him, and his reputation as a dedicated artist. Do you believe in separating the art from the artist? If so, skip ahead to the timestamp on the screen. I won't judge you for it. I think this is a very interesting question, which may become the subject of another video in the future. My take on it is that we can recognize the contributions an artist has made to their field, while also recognizing their flaws and the harm they might have caused in their lifetime. I don't think it's healthy to purely idolize and elevate any artist based on their artistic practice, without also looking at their behaviors and their life, and how their art might be contextualized within the scheme of who they were as a person. And as you know, I'm not here to idolize and elevate Renoir. Renoir was, more or less, a man of his time. He held the standard viewpoints on pretty much every social issue. This is to say, sexist, anti-Semitic, and racist by today's standards. In the book on Renoir by Barbara Ehrlich White, she contextualizes Renoir's statements and actions within the framing of his time period. For example, she contrasts a statement once made by Renoir that women have no place being artists with the actions he took within his life to support the careers of his female artist friends, like Berthe Morisot. She also contrasts statements that he made advising a friend against doing business with some Jewish art dealers because they were Jewish, and with his own later working relationship with those same dealers, and his friendship with his own Jewish sister-in-law. I understand the perspective Dr. Ehrlich White is operating out of here. Although Renoir may have expressed many of the common opinions of this time period, he also demonstrated through his actions that he was not actually so bigoted. Additionally, she mentions that he was prone to saying whatever he thought would please the people he was hanging out with at the time, to preserve his working relationships and keep him in everyone's good graces, and to avoid confrontation. So sometimes he expressed opinions to multiple people that were conflicting. Because of this, it's hard to know how much he actually felt on certain matters, and may have essentially been lying much of the time to make himself look good to important people. This argument doesn't totally sit well with me. Regarding the example about female artists, he had a few good friends who were female artists, and he also trained female pupils at later points in his career. Clearly, he must have believed that women were capable of being great artists. So why say the opposite? Why lie? Regarding anti-Semitism, there's a story wherein he was walking around Paris with Degas, who was severely anti-Semitic, and when they saw Pissarro, a Jewish painter friend of Renoir, they crossed the street to avoid running into him. This was apparently blatant enough that Pissarro noticed because he wrote about it in a letter to a friend who summarized, "He told me that since the anti-Semitic incidents, Degas and Renoir avoid him and don't acknowledge him anymore. What can be going through the heads of these intelligent men for them to become so stupid?" Degas was probably the one who asked to cross the street, but clearly Renoir went along with it, and it seemed to have hurt Pissarro. It's like if someone said, "Oh, sorry I blatantly ignored you and crossed the street when I saw you coming. It's just that you're gay, and I didn't want my good friend Mr. Homophobia McQueerbasher to feel uncomfortable." Why are you friends with Mr. Homophobia McQueerbasher? And why are you doing the most to make sure he's not uncomfortable? Another fact. Renoir was an anti-Dreyfusard. During his lifetime, there was a government scandal wherein the Jewish army captain, Alfred Dreyfus, was framed and accused of being a spy for the Germans, sparking a fresh burst of anti-Semitism in France. This, of course, is an oversimplified summary, and the reality is actually much, much worse than what I've just described. The majority of the country was, at least initially, of the anti-Dreyfusard stance, meaning that they believed Dreyfus was guilty. Renoir also held this belief. Those who believed that Dreyfus was innocent, which ended up being true, by the way, included Émile Zola, Monet, Mary Cassatt, Charpentier, Mirbeau, and Pissarro. Basically, almost all of Renoir's friends knew that Dreyfus was innocent. Of course, he wasn't the only one of his friends taking the opposite stance. Degas was also an anti-Dreyfusard, but he was so rabidly anti-Semitic that at this time he cut off lifelong friends who had been born Jewish, even though they had already converted to Catholicism. Renoir may have felt inclined to stick to the most mainstream opinions, much like he searched for mainstream approval in his professional life, because of his precarious social standing. I can wrap my head around that, but it's still disappointing. It just seems to me that given his friendships with women and with Jewish people, he had every opportunity to know better. Alternatively, if he was saying and acting in bigoted ways to gain favor with bigoted people, that's still disappointing to me. Again, I can wrap my head around it, but it feels slimy to me. And rather than making him seem bigoted necessarily, makes him seem overall conniving and skeevy and morally limp. All of it leaves a bad taste in my mouth, and I think that's justified. But the fact is that these beliefs don't really play into his painting anyway. Richard Whittington, in his article for ArtNet, argued that many people think Renoir is a misogynist because his paintings of women are so ugly, but I'm not really convinced of that. I think Renoir was trying to make his female nudes look beautiful, and many of us just happen to think they're ugly. The truth is that Renoir's paintings tend to be a very light, fluffy subject matter. They don't express any opinions or have any purpose except to look pretty. If anything, we can couple his incredibly inoffensive and meaningless work with his willingness to change his opinion to appease anyone he valued and his desire for mainstream success. If his paintings tried to make a statement, surely there would be someone who disagreed with that statement, and that was a risk he wasn't willing to take. Of course, art doesn't have to mean anything. The phrase art for art's sake rose to prominence during Renoir's life, signifying that art can just exist for the viewer's pleasure and contemplation without serving a specific purpose. It can be evaluated aesthetically and for how it plays with artistic principles like line, color, and form. But how does Renoir's art do when we evaluate it by these criteria? I'm gonna give you another warning here. This is not an unbiased take. I'm putting out my subjective opinion here. I'm trying to be fair and give Renoir some credit where credit is due, but pretty much nothing of what I'm about to say is technically factual. And I encourage you to disagree with me, because I think it's fun when people have strong opinions about art. I will be talking about color in my analysis, but please remember that all the images I'm going to be showing here are digital reproductions of paintings which may not convey the color as it appears in real life with exact accuracy. That being said, I have seen a lot of Renoir paintings in real life, and my opinions still hold. I'm going to start early in Renoir's career. Here are two paintings, 1 and 2. Take a moment to compare them. There are two paintings of the same scene from slightly different perspectives. Which painting do you find more compelling? Which painting represents the scene in a more interesting way? Consider the way the paintings capture lighting, how the shapes interact with one another, how the colors compare. Personally, I am much more compelled by painting 2. That painting happens to be by Monet. Painting 1 is Renoir. But why do I think painting 2 is better? First, there's the composition. In the Monet, there is a clear focal point, the little island with all the people standing on it. This is achieved through various means. Firstly, the island is in the center of the image. Secondly, the dark line of the little bridges connecting to the island and the tree and its reflection in the water operate like spokes of a wheel. The boats in the water are all angled towards the center as well. Additionally, the island is shaded and the color contrasts with the bright background and reflections on the water. Renoir's painting is a bit more muddled than that. It's a little bit more confusing because the middle section of the painting is so busy, both on the island and off of it. The island is still the focal point, but is not as clearly singled out as it is in the Monet painting. It doesn't have bright, clear space around it to highlight it. Instead, it has people and boats encroaching onto it. Monet, throughout his painting, seems to use consistently thick brushstrokes. There are very few truly thin lines. As a result, much of the painting is not highly detailed and relies on color and shape to represent its subject matter. For example, the people. Each of them are rendered with just a few brushstrokes and no faces. The trees, all the way in the background, don't have individual branches or trunks highlighted. They're just shown as a mass of bright green. There is a little bit of detail in the boats in the foreground of the painting, which hints to the wood they were built of. Overall, though, I feel that this painting is cohesive, in part because of the consistent use of thicker brushstrokes and the focus on shape and color over line. Meanwhile, Renoir tries to apply more detail to everything, which has the effect of warping the sense of space and making the painting look messy. He tries to add more details to the clothes of the people on the island, and even adds faces, which makes the island very busy, and makes it more difficult to tell the individual people apart. He's also added some details to the boats and swimmers in the background, and trunks and branches to some of the trees, which has the effect of bringing the background forward some and making the scene seem a little bit less three-dimensional than Monet's. Also, I honestly just really like the way Monet does water a lot better. It seems more fluid, and like a better representation of how water actually moves and looks in real life. Renoir is very attentive to including the details of things being reflective and establishing irregular patterns of waves and ripples in the water, but it doesn't really capture the appearance of a busy lake in the same way. My final point is about color. Monet has great colors that complement each other well. He also has great variation in the tones and hues. The background and the water are so bright and colorful, and all the people and structures are largely in darker and deeper colors. The colors all feel rich because they have a degree of contrast with each other. Meanwhile, Renoir's colors are all fairly tonally similar. He has a few spots of bright whites or orange or green, but most of his colors here are closer to the middle range when compared to Monet's, which means nothing pops quite as much. Basically, my feeling here is that Monet does a better job of fulfilling the Impressionist ideal of capturing light, movement, and the color of the scene. He captures the feeling and the ambiance and makes, in my opinion, a very visually pleasing painting. Renoir's painting may be a more faithful depiction of reality in his attention to detail and his use of colors that aren't quite so bright, because, let's face it, reality doesn't always arrange itself according to what will be the most interesting compositionally. In my opinion, though, this makes for a much less interesting painting. How you feel about this will depend on how much you care about things like line and detail compared to color, and there's no wrong opinion, but this is why I think the Monet painting is better. I wanted to start out with a comparison to show you that I don't just hate Impressionists overall. I think Impressionism can be quite good. I just don't think Renoir executed it as well as some of his contemporaries, and a lot of the criticisms I had from the first painting carry over to other ones. Let's look at a few more Renoir paintings. I'm gonna be faster this time. I promise this video isn't just gonna be a million more years of me describing paintings. Here is a painting we saw briefly earlier. It's one of Renoir's most famous. I understand the appeal of capturing a crowd scene where a bunch of young Parisians are dancing and having fun. To me, the way he does the dappled shade doesn't quite feel natural. The painting is also very busy, without much of a clear focal point, although those features could also count in his favor given the nature of the scene. This is also where we start to see what I describe as the Renoir soulless demon eyes. Look at how he paints the eyes. Dark, black upper lash line, dark, black pupils, no iris, little or no whites of the eyes. I do not like this. It continues here in another famous group scene of his. I want to give Renoir some credit for this painting because I do think it's pretty good. I especially like the little dog. I like that he uses some brighter colors here. However, I do not like the soulless demon eyes. These don't look like real people to me. They look like weird dolls or something. Throughout his career, Renoir allowed his style to change frequently. In this portrait, the texture of the entire painting is fuzzier and brighter colors are used. Although I feel like the blue-green watering can sort of disappears into the girl's skirt, I can appreciate the stylistic choices here more than in many of his other paintings. I like the colors he used, and I like that the little girl does not have demon eyes. He even made paintings that were more impressionism-y and textured, and ones that have blurrier backgrounds and more defined subjects in the foreground. As I expressed before, I don't think he really captured the impressionism of light in the same way that Monet did, and a lot of times his figures seem to me as if they were lit by an ambient front light and are just lined with shadows on the sides of their clothes and faces, rather than appearing as if the light were cast on them by a natural source, like the sun, which would make the shading less straightforward. What hurts me here is I also know that he was talented and had great potential. I honestly love this painting from very early on in his career. I love the way he uses light and shadow here, and how the details like the grasses on the forest floor pop. I love the texture of the bark. And here's another landscape from a little later on. I really like how this looks, and I think his work is a lot better when humans are not the focal point. Maybe it's just because it reminds me of Cézanne, who I like more, but I think his sense of light and shadow and color is amplified when he's not trying to portray people. I'm only showing one of his nudes, which I may censor, because I'm afraid of Big Daddy YouTube here. But just know that he did a lot of them, and this is considered to be one of the good ones. Frankly, I do not like them. I don't like the colors, the undertones of blues and greens, and the weird ambient front lighting. I don't like how the anatomy of the bent leg looks insane, and the general questionable anatomy, especially of the women's chest areas. One thing I will give Renoir credit for is his willingness to show women's body rolls, which is more evident in other paintings than in this one, and his portrayal of them is beautiful. However, overall, I do not like how he paints women, especially nude, and have to agree partially with the sentiment expressed best by his contemporary, the art critic Albert Wolff. Quote, "Try to explain to Monsieur Renoir that a woman's torso is not a mass of decomposing flesh with green and purple spots that indicate the state of total putrefaction of a corpse." So, it would be a lie to say I hate everything about Renoir's art, or that I hate everything about Renoir's painting. Through my search, I discovered a few paintings that I really admired, which I wasn't expecting. Those were generally the exception to the rule, though. My feeling at the end of the day is that, when compared to his peers, such as Monet, Manet, and Cézanne, Renoir is less innovative in his style and also less skilled in the execution. Now you know why I don't love Renoir's paintings, or Renoir as a person. But what about other people? I briefly mentioned the 2015 God Hates Renoir movement at the beginning, which led to actual protests outside the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and other institutions. This movement was what first led me to think critically about not only Renoir, but other big-name artists. So let's talk about what their actual complaints were. Max Geller's concerns are multiple. First, there's his general dislike for Renoir as an artist because he, quote, sucks as painting. As per Geller, quote, "In real life, trees are beautiful. If you take Renoir's word for it, you'd think trees are just a collection of green squiggles." He also describes them as, quote, "empty, calorie-laden steaming piles," suggesting that he also takes issue with the subject matter. As we've discussed, Renoir made many paintings of pleasant scenes of life in the upper class in France. As stated by Richard Whittington, when times got tough for Renoir, he, quote, "backtracked and began painting saccharine, bourgeois portraits." This is a critique that could be applied to many Impressionist artists. While the choice to portray everyday scenes of the bourgeois was revolutionary in the sense that it defied the standard expectations of the Academy, it didn't inspire reflections on scenes from history in the way that many academic paintings did, and it also didn't cause people to think critically about issues of class and industrialization in the way that realist painters often did. Instead, it's just rich people having a party. But Geller doesn't seem to hate Impressionism as a whole. He describes himself as agnostic towards other artists, including other Impressionists. It seems the issue is that Renoir doesn't provide enough in terms of aesthetic value to compensate for the shallowness of his subject matter. Geller is not the only one who seems to hold this opinion. When reading about the protest movement in question, I found that many authors reporting on this situation were not too eager to defend Renoir, whether or not they agreed with Geller's own actions. Whittington commented that, on moral grounds, Renoir's innumerable, dumb-faced, unflattering female nudes have seen him posthumously charged with sexism. Sebastian Smee from the Boston Globe wrote that Renoir was, quote, an artist he detests most of the time, such a syrupy, falsified take on reality. And finally, Kristen Capps from The Atlantic summed up, any institution foolhardy enough to have a Renoir exhibit knows by now to expect some kind of pushback, because everyone hates Renoir and everyone always has. Maybe even, yes, God. Clearly, this cannot be true entirely. Some people must like Renoir. His great-great-granddaughter Geneviève argued that the free market has proven the merit of Renoir's work, basically because it gets really high auction prices. The highest-selling Renoir painting went for $78.1 million in 1990, which in today's day would be equal to over $180 million with inflation factored in. However, as we may recall from the whole NFT situation, just because people are willing to pay a lot of money for something, that does not mean it's good art. Beyond all of these complaints is a deeper issue, which Geller refers to as cultural justice. So, something about museums. Most museums have a shitload of artwork that they own, and most of it is in storage and not on display. The Met, for example, has a collection of over 1.5 million pieces, and only about 5% of that is on display at any given time. Most museums are a lot smaller than that, but the point is they do have way more in storage than on display. And a lot of the stuff that's in storage only gets brought out every few years for a special exhibit. So, when you start to think about it, museum wall space is actually pretty valuable, and for every work that's on display, there are like 10 that are waiting behind the scenes that people rarely get to see. So, what paintings are worth the wall space? What paintings deserve to be part of the permanent exhibit, aka they are always on display, taking up wall space, and nobody else ever gets to take their spot? Lots of museums have many Renoir paintings in their permanent exhibit. Why? He was part of a very important art movement, although his work was not necessarily the most influential within that. He's a famous name that people will recognize, and that might make some people who don't know a whole lot about art want to see what the fuss is about. Some people definitely like his paintings, bless their hearts, but are they that important? Especially enough for them to be multiple of them on display in a single museum? Couldn't a similar effect be had just by putting a few of Renoir's paintings on display? And what about all the other art in storage? Is there anything else in the collection that might be more interesting, or by an underrepresented artist which might deserve some wall time? This is the root of that idea of cultural justice. Max Geller was not the first person to discuss some version of this idea. For example, the Guerrilla Girls is a group of feminist protesters founded in 1985 who staged various protests to bring awareness to racism and sexism in the arts. In 1989, they counted up the paintings in the Met's Modern Wing and found that less than 5% of the art there was made by women artists, but 85% of the nudes on display were of women. It's like naked women's bodies being discussed and stared at by a bunch of men, without women in the conversation, and then the men being celebrated for it. Except those men are also artists, which makes it different, maybe? Because genuinely, there are a lot of amazing paintings which are female nudes done by men. There just also need to be some male nudes done by women in there too, to balance it out. Or male nudes done by men, or paintings on any subject, clothed or unclothed, by women. And that's only tackling the issue from a super baseline feminist perspective. That's not even addressing the issue of race and how relatively few non-white artists there are in most major museums, or how the works of African, Latin American, and other indigenous cultures are displayed, not to mention how those works were acquired. Basically, there are a billion ethical problems with the standard operating procedure of museums, and we don't have time to get into all of that today. The point is that there are a lot of problems in museums and in the art world, and Renoir represents a lot of them, and he's not even good enough to make up for it. So, does God hate Renoir? No. That's just a goofy slogan that was used to make fun of the Westboro Baptist Church's famous homophobic catchphrase. Do I hate Renoir? Hate is a strong word. But as part of this project, I have tried to separate the art from the artist, which is something I don't usually like to do. And in doing so, I have found that I don't like the art, and I also don't like the artist. I didn't even get into all of the crazy shit I read about him. Like how he had a secret daughter who he kept a secret from his wife and sons for his whole life until he literally died, and his sons found out about her from reading his will. If anything, this crazy behavior makes me more interested in him, but I'd still rather see more Mary Cassatt or Bert Morisot or even Monet because I like his paintings more. Remember, this is all personal opinion. Disagree with me all you want. Renoir lovers, bring your strongest defense to the comment section. I value all critical thoughts about art history, and you know what? I'm open to having my mind changed. Try your best. Let me know if there are any art history topics you would like to see me cover. I've got a few ideas cooking up for next time, and I'm excited to talk about them. In the meantime, keep thinking.